I thought I'd take advantage of some time these days and continue with our commentary on Mark, session 37, and we're with chapter 10, having seen, everything that has gone on before, pretty much according to how we're doing it here. And the beginning of chapter 10, the first 12 verses, has to do with my Bible says, indissolubility of marriage. So that the famous line, what God has joined together, let not man separate. And so you have this very sort of demanding and kind of hard to understand commandment, which actually is an interesting example of going behind the Mosaic Torah, which allows divorce in chapter 24 of Deuteronomy, allows divorce and requires a man to give the wife, I guess, a certificate of divorce. The famous get in modern Judaism, or at least in modern practice, you can have a tremendous litigation. I've heard of cases where the woman wants to get this religious certificate of divorce, and the man won't give it, so that if you're not an expert, but an Orthodox Jew in this situation, can be like the Battle of the Roses or whatever that movie was. And of course, famously at the time of Jesus, you have these two pairs of rabbis, Shammai and Hillel, as there are these other, pairs of rabbis that transmit the oral Torah given to Moses on Sinai until it is codified in the Mishnah and then the Talmud, several centuries after Christ. And so a lot of scholars mentioned that the Pharisees are asking Jesus something about this or with this in the background, etc. Famously, of course, the Hillel school is sort of liberal, in this case, maybe counterintuitively. You can divorce the woman for any reason. I think the example is if she burns the soup or something. Because in Deuteronomy 24, he says that if the man discovers something in the wife that is displeasing to him, etc., and in Hebrew, it's very difficult to understand what it means. The nakedness of a thing or something indecent or maybe improper behavior, etc. I'm not going to try to get into that now. The issue being that the Shammai school was stricter and said you really have to have a reason to dismiss your wife, etc. But the interesting thing is that in this passage in Mark, followed by Matthew with an interesting variant, except in case of porneia, is the Matthean variant. And I don't even know if Luke has a parallel or not right now on this. But in Mark, what you have is Jesus, probably the greatest example of this return to the beginning, which is so typical of eschatology. The end corresponds to the beginning. Certain Latin expressions, so that reductio ad principium, you go back to, you're led back to the beginning, etc. Restitutio principii, you restore what happened at the beginning. And so you have this eschatological view that there is a temporary period which is obsolete once the final visitation of God arrives. And again, Harmut Stegemann, this scholar that I've mentioned, talks about this pre-fall Torah, where you don't have Levitical kosher dietary laws, nor this allowing divorce. And so you have this, Paul has a similar one, not going back as far. He says that the promise to Abraham, or the covenant with Abraham, preceded the giving of the Torah by 400 or 430 years in Galatians, so that this is really typical of eschatology. And so what you have here is Jesus saying that because of the hardness of their hearts, Moses wrote this command to give this a certificate of divorce. But from the beginning of creation, it says here, which is a very much eschatological language. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. He's talking about Genesis 1. And so I think that what's most interesting, number one, about this passage is not so much what Jesus says about divorce, but rather that in the new creation, even though that expression really is found more in Paul, you have this ideal, I suppose, of a joining in the flesh, becoming one with the other, and not then being able to dissolve that union. If you know, as a Catholic, if you study, you know, canon law or the sacrament of matrimony, as I did, from a good canonist turned theologian, maybe he was a theologian turned canonist, but a very good one in Madrid, to actually create this union, this contractual mutual agreement to spend your lives together as husband and wife in a project, etc., for life, you need such a level of knowledge of the other and maturity and understanding of what you're undertaking that, you know, given the resources and the interest, almost any marriage can be dissolved. And that's what canon law in the Catholic Church allows, the dissolution of marriage due to some defect in this, you know, vinculum, or whatever the matrimonial bond is called in canon law. So that in a sense, you can you know, dissolve unions that are not perfectly agreed to, entered into, etc. Interestingly, Matthew apparently, maybe not apparently, but Matthew might be said to have an exception. I think some Protestant churches believe that the exception would be adultery. That really doesn't hold water, because the word for adultery is not it's not the one used in Matthew 19:9. The exception is in case of porneia, and I'm not saying anything new when I repeat what many scholars, especially in the Catholic Church but elsewhere, understand porneia to represent. It represents the rabbinic or the Jewish zenut, prostitution, which was a term used in Judaism and still for an illicit union of a man and a woman due to too close bloodlines, due to consanguinity violation. And so Matthew would be saying, yes, if you are united in this illicit union, which the rabbis called zanut, prostitution, of course you should separate because you are not united according to what God has put together, etc. So you have that sort of understanding. And of course, then there's the Pauline privilege. I'm not going to get into all those sort of canon law things, but as I recall in Paul, when the two are not baptized, if one becomes baptized, he becomes a new, or she becomes a new creature. If the other person wants to remain in the marriage, then they can remain together, and maybe the Christian will sanctify the non-Christian party to the marriage. But if the other person wants to leave and separate, that's okay because they're supposed to be in peace. But the new creation status of baptism sort of wipes clean anything done before. And you're not bound by this union contracted not by God, but or that God by God putting it together, but because of merely human, sort of non-spiritual, non-Christian, contractual, um, union. And so you have another. And by the way, my notes in my Bible here that I add gives an example that's very interesting and may not be known to some of you. In Ezekiel 20, verse 25, there is a strange saying that Yahweh, through the mouth of the prophet, says, I even gave them precepts. I think this would be hukot in Hebrew, hukim, also mishpatim, and norms that were not good, and then mishpatim by which they could not live. So Ezekiel there's a great article by Scott Hahn and a fellow from Notre Dame arguing that this is a Zadokite reference to Deuteronomic school legislation that is considered invalid by Ezekiel or his Zadokite editors or himself. In any case, you have this idea even in Judaism, in Jeremiah, you certainly find that in Amos. I did not order sacrifices in the desert. Okay, well, what happened to Leviticus? That's in the desert. Those are a lot of sacrifices being ordered where you have different schools, attacking each other as to which came first, etc. And so here you have Jesus really taking eschatological stance that is somewhat unusual. I know Qumran has something to say about this same situation. I don't recall what it is right now. And so, as it happens often in Mark, when they're privately gathered, the disciples asked him again about this matter. And Jesus says, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery because he's still joined by God to her. And if she divorces the husband and marries another, she commits adultery, which the scholars would point out would be something applicable, not in Judaism, where the woman is not the one that can initiate or do a divorce, but more in the Roman world. And we were talking about Rome, I think last time, about the fire. And so this would definitely be a pagan Roman law type setting. And then moving along, and we're going to approach chapter 11, which will then be very rich or heavy, charged with a lot of different stuff that I've studied a lot more. You then have a sort of a parallel passage to what we saw before. They bring children to Jesus. And of course, in Judaism, children were dirty and you didn't really want to be around children. So the disciples rebuked them. But when Jesus saw this, he was indignant and said, let the children come to me. Do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of God. Whoever does not receive the kingdom of God like a child shall not enter it. So he doesn't say like Matthew, I think it is, if you don't become as a child, you shall not enter the kingdom. But here you have to receive the kingdom, which I think is tantamount to the same thing. You shall not enter it. And he took them in his arms and blessed them, laying his hands on them. And we're almost done. It's a shame that in some churches where they used to have schools called lots of hugs, they had to remove that because this thing took on a totally different meaning in the sex abuse crisis by the clergy. So we need to keep reminding ourselves of that tragedy. We'll continue next time.